We can all argue whether a certain sports star, a celebrity, or even a CEO deserves a certain wage. And sometimes we may uncover quite radical differences of opinion between us, whether someone is worth a certain salary, especially if they've just missed an open net. But most of us can agree that all workers, no matter where they're located, should enjoy decent working conditions and be paid wages that are adequate enough for them to be able to live off of. Not only is there a general agreement on this, this premise is also recognized as a basic human right under Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and further underpinned by ILO Conventions 95 and 131, which deal with worker wages. Accordingly, wages and benefits paid to workers for a standard working week should at least meet legal or industry minimum wages standards and always be sufficient to meet basic needs of workers and their families. Unfortunately, this is seldom the case in countries where the bulk of our consumer products are produced. So, what are responsible companies to do? How can they help ensure that adequate wages, a living wage, if you will, is being paid to workers throughout their supply chains? In this video, we're joined by a special guest to talk about the idea of a living wage and what companies can do to promote sustainable livelihoods in their supply chains. Stick around to the end and we'll also provide you with some resources to continue to explore this topic. And remember, if you find this video useful, please don't forget to give us a like before you leave. With me today is Bart Slob, Director of Ethics at Work, a consultancy that promotes sustainable business practices and decent work. He's worked with such organizations as the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the European Commission, Oxfam, and the International Trade Center in Geneva, a joint agency of the UN and the WTO supporting sustainable and inclusive trade in developing countries. Welcome, Bart. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, David.
So let's dive right in. You have a lot of experience around the concept of decent work and promoting responsible supply chains, particularly in emerging economies. So first of all, perhaps you can provide us with some conceptual orientation. What exactly is a living wage, and why is it so important when we're talking about supply chains?
A living wage means that the wage a worker earns in a working week is enough to provide for them and their family's basic needs. This includes housing, education, and healthcare, as well as some discretionary income for unexpected emergencies. Living wages obviously vary with the cost of living. And that's why a living wage in a capital city tends to be higher than in a rural town. But even for large cities in the same country, there can be huge differences. So the living wage in Shanghai, for instance, is almost twice as high as in Chengdu, which is also a large city in China. And in India, there are also big differences. The living wage in Uttar Pradesh in northern India, for example, is about 40% lower than the living wage in Tamil Nadu, which is in the south. Now, in the context of global value chains, such as the garment industry or the food sector, a living wage is an important issue because even though it's recognized as a basic human right, in practice, workers at the beginning of the value chain, garment workers, for example, almost never earn the wages that are high enough and compatible with the living wage.
Okay, but in many jurisdictions, of course, governments have set up minimum wage standards. So I'm wondering if these standards or the laws, if they're not sufficient safeguards for companies and their workers. If, for example, we look at a company with an extensive supply chain in South Asia, for example, can they not just ensure that their suppliers agree to pay at least the minimum wage in that country, as decided by the national governments in that jurisdiction? And that would be suffice for companies to ensure that they're meeting their responsibilities.
Oh, if only minimum wages were high enough. The issue here is that minimum wages set by governments in the global south and also in many developed countries tend to be too low. In a situation that is repeated throughout the global south, Government-sanctioned minimum wages are simply not enough to live on. The wage a garment worker in Bangladesh gets, for example, is about 3 times lower than the actual living wage in that country. But states are also under a lot of pressure to keep wages low. If governments raise the minimum wage, large companies may choose to simply move their operations elsewhere or to start sourcing from different places. This is what we call the race to the bottom. Countries compete for foreign direct investment and trade by keeping their standards really low. While this may create lots of low-paid jobs, it doesn't really provide sufficient income and benefits for ordinary workers.
Right. Now, I understand that Cambodia recently instituted a new minimum wage for its textile and footwear industry after coming under quite significant pressure from the EU.
Yeah, that's right. The new minimum wage was set at around $190, which amounted to a 5% increase. But even this seems to fall short of an actual living wage. In the Cambodian garment industry, over 80% of workers are women, often with families and young children to provide for. And with escalating living costs in housing, food, clothing, education, transport, healthcare, in fact, the Asia Floor Wage Alliance calculated the living wage in Cambodia should be about $283 a month. So that is a difference of more than 25%. So companies that get some degree of comfort in knowing that workers in their supply chains are receiving the minimum wage may need to reassess just how comfortable they are with doing this alone, as this is not necessarily a living wage and is not enough for workers to live on.
So, this is obviously a very complex issue and one that probably needs to be assessed on a case by case basis by companies as part of their human rights due diligence activities. But what can companies do in order to demonstrate now that they're indeed respecting human rights and ensuring that workers in their supply chains are at least being provided with wages that meet their basic needs and those of their families?
Well, as you've noted, this is a very complex situation, but this complexity is no excuse for companies doing nothing. It's not only a moral obligation. Increasingly, legislation in different jurisdictions is mandating that companies perform due diligence to ensure that they are respecting human rights within their operations, which includes their supply chain. But you asked me about what companies can do, so here are a few things. One, they should encourage their suppliers to support freedom of association and collective bargaining. Workers should be allowed to negotiate on wages and benefits with their employers. Two, they should research living wages in the countries where their supply chains are located and work with their suppliers to transition towards fair living wages. Highlighting success stories, encouraging better social dialogue, and building capacity and training on fair wage negotiations between workers and management. Three, they can adjust purchasing practices in line with supplier wage policies, trying to minimize production peaks and overtime to reduce pressures on suppliers and their workers, and ensure that they listen to workers' voices, especially with respect to fair wages and benefits. And four, finally, they can try to influence governments, particularly around issues of a minimum wage. Companies often complain that they are too small or too insignificant to influence governments. We've seen cases where this has been effective, particularly when companies act together. But whatever companies do, they should not use the lack of certainty about the level of a living wage as a reason for inaction. Clearly, the obligation to ensure a living wage falls within their mandate, both within their immediate reach and within their supply chain. And what's more, it is simply the right thing to do.
Absolutely. Bart, I want to thank you very much for your time and for your insights around this concept of a fair living wage.
It was my pleasure, David.
So my takeaway from all of this is that there's certainly significant attention on this issue of a living wage currently, and this will only increase. So it's probably best for companies to start tackling this issue sooner rather than later. I also want to point out that there's been some excellent tools and guidance developed by a number of organizations recently, including the salary matrix for living wage, the Align tool under the umbrella of the Living Wage Lab, which can be very useful as part of your due diligence activities. And we'll include links to these resources in the description box on YouTube. And we'll also include links to organizations like the Global Living Wage Coalition and others that help demonstrate some of the work that's being carried out collaboratively between brands, retailers, and trade unions in this area. Thank you very much for your time. And once again, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel for more sustainability insights just like these.